Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of Princess State of Mind, where we talk about fiction, fairy tales, and the fairer sex. I'm Faith Moore, and I am really excited about our guest today. When I published Saving Cinderella, I noticed that right next to mine in the same category was another book with Cinderella in the title. It was called Cinderella Didn't Live Happily Ever After, The Hidden Messages in Fairy Tales by Dr. Anne Beall. And when I looked into it further, I noticed that we were covering a lot of the same topics and reaching completely opposite conclusions. So I decided I absolutely had to have her on to talk about it. Welcome to the show, Dr. Beall.
Thank you so much for having me. So nice to meet a fellow author.
It's a pleasure. I agree. And I just want to make sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Is that right?
Beall, yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So before we get into kind of the nitty-gritty of the book, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write this book?
Sure. So I am a researcher by training. I have a PhD in social psychology. And many, many years ago, I actually was interested. I've always been interested in fairy tales. I've always loved them. But I got interested in the emotions of characters when I was in graduate school, which was not recently, but many years ago. And I analyzed the emotions of these characters and found some significant differences. Always found that interesting, went off to actually finish my degree, ended up starting a company, a market research company, but I've always held that interest. And this year I thought I'll take that back up and actually do some additional types of analyses. So that's how I came to write this book. Great.
That's awesome. And we're going to get into all of the things that you talk about in the book, but I know that you went through an analytic process with the book. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So I am a person who's big into numbers. That's my business, actually. And so I went through and I actually coded the book with very specific definitions in mind. And then I had another person who was just given the definitions, that's it. And she coded the books. The Grimm's book is actually what it is. It's an analysis of 169 fairy tales with human beings as characters.
Right.
And she coded it as well. And then we did pretty significant analyses on, what percentage of characters have X, Y, or Z and whatnot. So it's a pretty thorough process. And we had pretty high inter-rater agreements. About 93% of the codes were exactly the same, which is good. So that was the approach that we took. And I actually was somewhat surprised at what we found. So.
Well, that's interesting. Okay, I'm going to want you to talk more about that in a second. So I read the book. Thanks for sending me a copy. And I really enjoyed it. I found it to be really well written, very engaging, and completely disagreed with everything you said. So one of the things that I hate about social media, I actually love social media, but one of the things I really hate about it is the way that people feel when they disagree with each other, that they have to kind of become incredibly rude or like own each other or somehow win or, and sort of ruin another person's life. And I really hate that. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to just talk to you about this. And so are you up for a little bit of a debate?
Why not? Why not?
Excellent.
I actually like differing points of view as well. Yeah. And I support, authors like yourself putting forward a different point of view. It may not be one that I totally agree with, although I found some points in your book very interesting and I did agree with some of them. But yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Excellent. So let's start with this. Tell us why. Why did Cinderella not live happily ever after?
Well, I think that poor Cinderella is not really in a great place to be queen or to take over a kingdom eventually. I assume that she would marry Prince Charming and she will, I think she's not well equipped for the situation she's in. I also think she's at a power disadvantage. I think she is, and I think you actually point out she's a very kind and good person. And I believe she is as well. Mm-hmm. But I think that he primarily seems to be marrying her for her beauty, which concerns me a little bit. And I worry, given the analysis that we did of the queens in the rest of the Grimm's fairy tales, they don't seem to fare all that well. In fact, their most common emotion is actually sadness. They cry a lot. So I think that, she I think is headed for a situation where she's at a power disadvantage. Other women are going to be trying to get her spot. I think that she's not well equipped for the situation she's taking on. And lastly, I think she has punctuality issues.
Yeah, I think I would too, though. If I just met the man in my dreams, I might forget.
It's very true. It's very possible that time gets away from us in these situations.
Definitely, I would be guilty of that too, I think. So yeah, I mean, I think this is perhaps the central place where we might come to disagree, because when I read, for lack of a better term, feminist critiques of fairy tales, which I think is kind of what you're making here with these ideas about beauty and what it will be like for her when she's queen, etc. My issue there tends to be the way in which that type of critique seems to take these fairy tales very literally. Your book is called the Hidden Messages in Fairy Tales, but I think the only way to get to a conclusion, for example, like, her success is based on her physical beauty, is to read it very literally. And for me, fairy tales aren't literal at all. I think that they're really symbolic, really allegorical. And I was wondering what your thoughts are about symbolism versus realism in fairy tales.
Well, I think it's interesting what we pick and choose to say is symbolic. So I think that's where, feminists and non-feminists may disagree as to, well, this is symbolic. Well, no, that's not. Well, this is literal. Well, no, it's not. So, we could have a huge debate about what's, symbolic and what's literal. And the original fairy tale, which is the one that I'm probably most familiar with, and I think you have an extensive knowledge about the Disney versions, and I do like them. But I definitely do. But I would say, the thing that I actually like about your perspective is that you talk about this being a rags to riches story. Mm-hmm. And I agree. I also think this is a story that's very, very much about, being discriminated against, being victimized, and coming past that. The only part where I start to have issues is where it seems as though it's a man sort of saving a woman. And I actually like some of the fairy tales where the woman saves the man. So, there's lots of different ways that you can kind of look at these things. My concern is if it's always a certain version that we see, I wonder what impact that has on women in terms of their perceptions of themselves and womankind.
Sure. And I definitely think that it would make sense to feel that way if we were meant to read the story as the story of a girl who is so beautiful that even though she's a servant, the prince recognizes her or falls in love with her for her beauty and marries her, and that's the only way that we can achieve success in this life if we don't have power or wealth. But I think, you say we have to sort of pick and choose, or people tend to pick and choose which things are symbolic and which things aren't. And so for my part, I actually think it's all symbolic. I think that the whole idea of fairy tales is that there's this, in my book, I call it a fairy tale shorthand, but other writers and researchers have called it other things. Mythographer Marina Warner, she calls it a symbolic Esperanto, that each trope that appears over and over again in fairy tales, like beauty or the princess, the prince, the queen, the witch, the forest, all of these things, always represent the same thing from story to story. And that's how you can kind of very quickly internalize, the deeper meanings of these really short tales. And so for me, the beauty of the princess is symbolic of the inner beauty. So if you were to meet Cinderella in real life, she could be ugly, and that would be totally fine. But the idea of the fairy tale is that the outer represents the inner. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think it's interesting that we've never seen an ugly Cinderella ever. We've never seen that. We've never seen it in a movie. We've never seen her described that way. In fact, in the original tale, basically, her gowns are part of actually her beauty and what makes her amazing. And I think, if it was all symbolic, I don't know, why not then have a fox and a hen? Why not have be a male, being in that role versus a female. And I don't think it's all symbolic, because I think there's some parts of this that we do like very, we do take quite literally. And when girls dress up as princesses and talk about marrying, handsome prince. I mean, there are a lot of women interested in marrying the princes of England, you know, for pretty significant reasons. So I think there's some literal aspect to this that's very real. That's the reason why I love your avatar. It's very beautiful, and it's you. It's not a symbol. It's you. You know.
Well, yeah, it's me as a Disney princess. So I definitely wouldn't expect to look in the mirror and see myself looking like that. But thank you. I love it too. It's Laurel Springer at Laurel and Arts. You know, I think, you know, you're touching on something that's another thing I wanted to talk about, which is why these fairy tales are so important to us. You know, you said it, little girls love these stories and they want to dress up and they want to play pretend about, you know, the rags turning into the ball gown, or, you know, going to the ball, or marrying the prince, or whatever it is. You know, they do that. You know, I'm sure that you know this since we both researched the same thing, but, you know, Cinderella is one of those stories that's been around by some accounts for, you know, in some way or another for over 5,000 years. And, you know, I find it really hard to believe that this story that is so entrenched in our culture and our lexicon and all of this is really all about shoes and a dress. I find that really hard to put together with the ways in which this is so deeply meaningful for so many people. And so is it just that we're all sort of victims of the patriarchy, or is there something else going on here?
Well, it's definitely not about shoes and a dress. I definitely think it's a lot more than a story about shoes and a dress. Because if that were the case, then you and I would go out and buy our magic shoes and our magic dress and we'd be good to go, you know? But I think it is.
I have mine.
Oh, you have that? That's good. I'll have to find out where you got those. No, I think this story is, you know, it's one that we can relate to. And I think, yeah, actually your point that you make, which is, I think, a really good point, which is it's about coming into womanhood. It's about that transition. I think that's a very good and excellent thing, that it does draw on things that matter to us. It is about love at first sight. It is about, you know, being, you know, your inner self being misrepresented by your clothing. I mean, I think it is about those things. But my concern is, why is that always then more about the female getting saved by the prince, the female marrying up? That's the stuff that I take issue with. And nothing wrong with a woman marrying up, but I want to see also men marrying up. And as you know from my book, actually, that's very common in Grimm's fairy tales, for a man to marry up, to marry a princess, and eventually to become king. We don't see those stories as often. We don't see the stories of the female heroines in Grimm's fairy tales, you know, the woman who's with a handkerchief, you know, addressing the king. And, you know, we don't see that stuff quite to the same degree.
Okay, so it seems like your take is that when Cinderella goes to the ball, or when you know, the prince sees Snow White for the first time, or you know, I think in the Grimm's version he sees her for the first time lying in the coffin, right?
Yeah, in the Grimm's version, yeah, he sees her, yes, in the coffin.
Exactly. So, you know, when the prince sees the princess, he literally is responding to something physical. See, because for me, you know, for example, Cinderella's ball gown, that's the moment in which the inner beauty that she's always had, and that we know she's had because we're reading that symbolism that, you know, her inner beauty is represented by her outer beauty. That's the moment when her inner beauty is made manifest for the whole world to see. And off she goes to the ball, and the prince sees that, symbolically represented by the outer trappings of her dress and you know, and her physical beauty, etc. And he recognizes a woman of worth, even though she's poor and obscure. And so, you know, I agree with you that that's what's happening. He sees a woman, a beautiful woman in a beautiful magical dress. But for me, I think we're supposed to read that. You know, we're supposed to read that in a different way. And so I just, you know, are you saying that no, this is really a story that's telling us that this is how to get a man. Like if you want to marry up, this is how you got to do it.
Well, I think if she went in rags to the ball gown, to the ball, I don't believe he would have had the same response to her. And I believe that even though the sisters dress up, the actual physical characteristics of the stepsisters are they're actually not attractive. I think in at least that's my understanding is that they're physically not as attractive as her. Certainly in the movies they are displayed that way. So my belief is that had she shown up looking like a scullery maid, he would have never looked at her. So I think there's something there. I agree with you that there's symbolism around. We now are putting a dress on her. It is transformative. We all know that wearing things is transformative. You know, wear stuff that you feel very comfortable in. You act very differently than wearing stuff that's very formal. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's merit to both points of view. I think it's both literal and I think it's symbolic. I think that's why the story works for children who don't understand symbolism, you know, at very young ages. But I think that also why it works for people like you and me. It's nice to see a Cinderella story because we understand the symbolism.
Sure. I mean, I think I would argue that children kind of understand the symbolism without knowing that they understand it. You know, it's my experience. And again, you know, I definitely haven't done a whole big study about children's play, and that would be really fun to do. You know, but it's my experience just as a teacher for 10 years, et cetera, that the thing that girls are pretending about is the transformation rather than the marriage. You know, like they almost never get to the ball. You know, they sort of want to over and over again to pretend that, you know, the bibbidi bobbidi boo, my dress is transformed. And I think that really speaks to, you know, that it's, you know, I think a lot of these stories, and I think this is something that gets missed, is a lot of these stories are really about women. They're about beautiful women at the center, beautiful internally women at the center of a story. And to me, that seems really feminist. And I think when we start to kind of critique the literal ways that they get, you know, out of their horrible situation or that they learn to grow into their womanhood, et cetera. I think we kind of lose that and we say it's all about these men, you know, coming in to save the day when really these are stories about women, you know, and I wonder how you balance that.
Yeah, I think they are stories about women and men, at least the Grimm's fairy tales. I think there's a lot of stories about men, you know, enacting feats of bravery and saving princesses, a lot of princes saving princesses, as you know, in those stories. I think they have a lot to say about a lot of things. I think the fairy tales certainly tell us that women tend to marry up for beauty. We know that from our analysis, that it's essentially a description of her appearance that leads her to, you know, and it's often, by the way, an instantaneous meeting between a king and a young woman, and next thing you know, he offers to marry her. So I think they have a lot to say about both men and women. And I think that, yeah, I think they're not insignificant messages, I would say.
So do you think when, you know, when we as little girls or, you know, whoever we are reading these stories, when we read something like that the prince saw the princess and immediately was in love with her and they rushed off to get married right away. I mean, is your concern that we might then grow up to be women who feel that like the only way to feel love for someone or to expect that we're going to have that kind of connection with someone, and that if we don't, that maybe it's not real, or, you know, that we have these expectations from fairy tales that are unrealistic? Is that sort of the concern here?
Well, I think fairy tales are a part of our culture. There's lots of things in our culture that shape human behavior. I think the notion that beauty is an important characteristic that, you know, leads you to find an eligible mate. I think that's a message that's given to women a lot, not just through fairy tales, but it's given to women a lot in almost every other media. And it leads to some real problems, I think, for women. And it leads to women having issues with, you know, eating disorders and everything else. And as you know, the beauty culture is an incredibly successful culture. So, you know, I mean, yeah, I think my concern is that I would like to see, first of all, I like Cinderella. So, you know, I'm glad you're trying to save her. And I like that that's a story out there, but there are other stories as well. I'm not actually against Cinderella as a story.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of different things out there. And as you said, Cinderella is up to 5,000 years old. And obviously there's a part of us that does respond to that. There's a part of us as women that responds to it. There's a part of it, I think, that cultures, have the idea of this poor downtrodden woman being saved by a man. That's a lovely story. Nothing wrong with that. I just don't want that to be the only story.
Sure. Yeah. And I found your analysis really fascinating because, who takes the time in their regular life, right? If they're not writing a book about this, to kind of like code all of these stories and figure out, what's going on and whether all of these similarities. And it was really interesting to me to read and to see, as you say, like the queens, they're not so happy. Actually, let's talk about that for a second. When I read that and I read your take that Cinderella would marry the prince would become the king essentially, and that would make Cinderella the queen, and then she would become one of these queens from the fairy tales that are
right.
not so happy. That sort of made me think for a second, because I actually don't necessarily think that that's what we're supposed to get from the story. Like, I think the story is telling us something, a sort of universal truth about, you need to be your true self and you need to find your way out of, your difficult situations, etc. And I'm not sure that we're supposed to necessarily feel like, and then, the sequel, she goes on and becomes the queen. And the reason I feel that way is because I feel like queens, particularly stepmother queens, or just stepmother characters in general, are another kind of element of fairy tales where they represent the sort of older woman, the crone, who has kind of reached her or past her sort of sexual maturity. And it's from her that the princess has to separate. And so I'm sort of wondering what your feelings are about all those interplay, the way those things play out together.
So I have pretty strong feelings about stepmother characters because I think, first of all, they are never characterized positively, ever. There's not one stepmother who's nice. Stepmothers try and kill their children. They try and do all kinds of terrible things to them. And I actually think that short shrift stepmothers in general, and I think actually stepmothers in our culture are somewhat maligned, and I think that is partly because of fairy tales. I don't see a positive depiction of them anywhere, quite honestly. And I think that's sad because, frankly, there are a lot of women who are stepmothers. And I find it very strange. And I think this is one of the things that truly surprised me, was that when we did the analysis of power, what we found was that, powerful men in fairy tales are kings and princes. They are powerful and they are generally benevolent. They are good guys. Powerful women in fairy tales are stepmothers and witches.
Right.
And they are people who, by the way, are not benevolent. Over half the time, they're actually evil. And in fact, they sometimes are disguised so they can kind of look good, but they're not. So the message is that essentially powerful men are good and powerful women half the time probably aren't. I think that actually puts powerful women at a disadvantage. I think we look at powerful women with kind of I don't know, she could be evil. And I think that's some of where it comes from. And I don't know if you've seen that Saturday Night Live skit with Hillary Clinton where she's dressed up as a bride, and people keep coming. Yeah, it's on Saturday. Yeah, she's dressed up as a bride she has a Halloween party. She's dressed up as a bride. Okay. And people keep coming in and they keep saying, "Oh my God, what a great witch costume." She's like, "I'm a bride." And they go, "Oh, I see it now. I see it. Yeah. I saw how you wear it. Yeah." But I think, witches, I don't see witches as just symbolic. I don't, and I think that, by the way, the idea of older women being kind of evil, it's not all the case. I mean, there are older women in Grimm's fairy tales who are actually very good, but in general, sort of this powerful older woman is really scary. And I don't think that's a great message to give to anyone, especially girls.
Well, I totally agree with you in the literal sense. I absolutely agree. And that, lots and lots of people are stepmothers and are wonderful people. And it's fabulous that they've come into the lives of these children, et cetera. And lots and lots of powerful women are really wonderful also. And obviously there's nothing wrong with that. for me, the reason that it's the man is that these are stories about girls growing into their womanhood. And there has to be this kind of pull in the opposite direction. There has to be a pull back towards childhood that they need to kind of break free from. And that is best represented by a female character who has kind of gone through that and is now sort of jealously trying to pull the girl back, because that's how she kind of manages herself in the world. She sees like, okay, I can't continue to ally myself with this. I need to move forward and become my own woman. And so I don't think necessarily it's saying all women are evil. I don't think it's a story about these are stories about all women. I think it's really as it's something that the princess or the female character is dealing with in the story. I mean, do you disagree? I mean, do you think it's like it means that powerful women are evil?
I think it's easy to view them that way. I would say the notion that she has to separate herself away from a woman who's somehow gone past the sexual maturity is an interesting idea. The only problem is it doesn't really work. For example, in Snow White, she's actually taken to the forest when she's 7 years old. So she's really not actually in that place of moving into sexual maturity. She's really just a child. So, I think it's an interesting idea. It doesn't quite hold for me when I kind of apply it across, and I'm not sure why the separation has to be from the stepmother per se. So it's always the stepmother who's victimizing women. I think to me that the message that's conveyed there is that older, less attractive, powerful women are going to be very, very threatened by young, attractive women. And I don't like that message so much. I want us to actually all get along.
Sure. And so do I. Fair enough. I mean, I think it is just it's a different read on the story. And I think, Snow White, it's so interesting you mentioned Snow White, because for me, Snow White is actually an allegory about puberty. And I think, I agree in the original or the Grimm's fairy tale, she is much younger than, for example, in the Disney version where she is 14, which is literally the moment of puberty, right? And the apple in the Disney version is the only thing that the witch brings, versus in the Grimm's version, she brings all kinds of other things, but all kinds of other things related to womanhood, right? Like the stays that she laces too tightly and the comb that she puts in her hair and the apple. So, I definitely think all of that is still in there, even though she's 7. And I would argue that perhaps when the story was originally told, 7 was akin to 14, the way that 14 is now for us. People died earlier, matured earlier, married earlier, all of that back then. So I really, I see that, I really see that story as having to do with puberty.
Oh yeah, actually, that's one of your strongest arguments that I enjoyed actually in your book, was that description of how she's trying out her attractiveness and the dwarves, and they sort of respond to her as if she's an adult, but so it's actually, that's very strong, and I totally agree with that point that is a place where she kind of is becoming her own woman. And I think that's very, very clear.
Yeah, and so I definitely hear your point about these women. Where is the kind stepmother that comes in and sort of saves someone from maybe an evil man or something. I don't know. And, I guess it's just a sort of different way of thinking about why those characters are in there and what they do. And, we're running slightly out of time, but I definitely want to address Beauty and the Beast. Because this is actually my favorite fairy tale of all time. And you say a couple of things which, I hear a lot. So there are obviously things that people are thinking about and that are resonating with people, and you address them very interestingly and very well. The first is that Belle is a victim of Stockholm Syndrome, and you don't necessarily say that she is. You mentioned that is something that comes up a lot, and I wondered if you feel that way. And I guess for those who don't know, Stockholm Syndrome is when the captive falls in love with their captor, right? So do you think that's true?
I find it hard to believe that if I was taken away from my family and I was put in very lonely circumstances, and I was actually around someone who is fairly aggressive and rude, that, yeah, I have a hard time imagining that I would somehow, especially sort of that you're held against your will. Now, over the course of the movie, basically, she essentially, he does allow her, in fact, to leave. It's actually one of my favorite movies, actually. Yeah, lovely. And I think the symbolism, by the way, is interesting with the woman saving the man, right? So I think that's really lovely in that way. But I think that, the notion that somehow that this circumstance would lead to affection, if you reverse the genders, it doesn't work so well. And I think that's, where I think things start to go awry for me. I also see it very much as has a lot to say about sort of what's appropriate and inappropriate in terms of male suitors. So, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and that was actually the second thing I was going to ask you about, is because you say in your book, the story wouldn't work if the woman was ugly and rude and the man was handsome. And I agree with you. I think it totally wouldn't work. But the reason I think it wouldn't work is because I think the story is actually a story about male urges. I think it's about the prince at the beginning has sort of let his baser male instincts kind of run amok, and the beast form is just sort of symbolic of those things, and that a woman might have other things that were her sort of baser instincts, but they wouldn't turn her into a beast necessarily. They might turn her into something else. And I think that, then it's Belle's sort of unwavering ability to be truly herself that kind of inspires him to channel those urges in protection of her, or in for love of her, etc. And so for me, the reason it wouldn't work to swap the genders is because it's actually a story about gender. And I wonder, is that, do you take issue with that in general, or do you agree that that's what's going on? I mean, what is your take there?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in terms of male urges, or, his sort of kind of becoming very beastly, and that being sort of this extreme version of masculinity. I hadn't thought of it in that way. That's an interesting take, actually. And I think it does not work with the genders, partly for that reason. I think the other reason it doesn't work is because I think because women are bringing beauty to the table, an ugly woman coming to the table but being very good in their heart will not quite work. So I think that's part of the reason it doesn't work. And I also think the concept of a woman imprisoning a man is very different than a man imprisoning a woman. And women are often imprisoned in fairy tales. And so I think in fairy tale land, we have some sense of some things being okay and that we can work past them with one gender, but maybe not the other. So,
sure, I think that's true, and I think the way that you read that has to do with the way that you sort of read gender relations in general. Whether or not it's okay for those things to be different or not be different. And so I hear you that there isn't really a way to kind of mesh those things if you hold certain ideas and ideals in real life. It's hard to mesh those things with the fairy tale. So I think, but it is interesting what you say, to look and say, like, what would it be like if the genders were switched? And for me, I guess that's sort of like a good evidence for why you can't switch them, is that they are sort of about male and female relations.
Right.
But I can see that you could look at it in the way of like, but they should be able to be switched. I think, I hear you there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you may have read in the book that, women marry all kinds of inappropriate creatures, men who haven't, Bearskin is an example of a man who hasn't shaved or washed himself in 7 years, and he is betrothed to this woman The Beast is another example. A woman marries an iron stove at one point. A woman marries a donkey, an actual donkey. So, these are examples in Grimm's fairy tales where you're like, hey, it never goes in the opposite direction. Men do not marry donkeys. They do not marry iron stoves, and they don't marry women who haven't, washed themselves in 7 years. What's going on?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I actually heard recently an interesting take on that, which is that they were stories to help women deal with arranged marriages, and that wouldn't necessarily happen for the man. The man was, if you had an arranged marriage, then perhaps the man was sort of older and more established, and he was getting this younger woman, and the idea was that she would just kind of like learn to love him. I'm not totally sure that I buy into that, but it does speak to your point of like why it's the woman marrying all these strange things and the man doesn't have to do that.
Yeah, arranged marriages go both ways, I think. And I think Henry VIII, actually, one of his marriages was arranged for him. I believe it was, I forget, but when she showed up, he was horrified at how ugly she was. He never consummated that marriage. So I think it probably goes both ways. But
yeah,
anyway.
Anne of Cleves, and I think there's actually, there's some debate as to whether that was actually the case or whether he just kind of, he was Henry, and at that point, 1536 had passed, so he would become pretty crazy at that point. But yeah, that was definitely his excuse for why he decided not to consummate that marriage. But anyway, we're out of time.
Oh.
And I really appreciate you very brave to come on here and know that I was going to disagree with everything you said, and you did an excellent job. And
it was a pleasure. You're an absolutely lovely person, and it was just really nice to talk to you.
And you, likewise. Yeah. And I hope people will check out your book. So tell us where they can find it and where they can find you if they're interested in learning more.
Okay. So it's basically Cinderella Didn't Live Happily Ever After. Do you love that cover? The cover.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah.
You can find it on Amazon. It's in paperback, and it's also in ebook. So if you're interested, you can check it out.
Great. And for those of you watching, I actually put the link to the book in the description of this video. So when you're watching, you can just click there. And are you on Twitter or somewhere else where people could find you?
I am. I actually have a Facebook page for this, and then I'll be doing lots of different events. So we'll be posting probably there. So
perfect. That's excellent. Well, thank you so much for being on here. I really appreciated it. It was a great conversation. I wish more people could have this kind of conversation with each other about fairy tales and about everything. So thanks so much for being on here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. And thanks everybody out there for watching. Don't forget to press the bell and subscribe, and stay tuned for more details about my book, Saving Cinderella, and where you can find that. And also, tomorrow is the last day to pre-order, because the book actually comes out tomorrow. So today is actually the last day to pre-order. Tweet me a picture of your checkout page, tag me, use hashtag Saving Cinderella, and you could be entered to win this poster. All right. Until next time, everybody. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.